Now, let me say again, as I said before the camera went on, today's discussion, lecture is the right word, I'm afraid, and I know lecture is a bad word. It means boring, and that's what today's going to be. So I hope you took plenty of vitamins. I hope you got some of that sugar, and you're up a little bit, and the coffee is not decaf, but the regular stuff. And so today I want to talk about the star of justice, and I think I'll start right out by drawing my star so you can look at it. It is in the notes, and I've picked the star of justice because it has 5 points and a center, 6 aspects, 6 facets, and I'm going to suggest for you today that justice has 6 aspects. Now, before we start, let me just ask you, when I say justice, now, I'm really not asking for a discussion, we'll be overwhelmed. I'm just asking, pedagogically here to stimulate. When I say justice, what sort of things come to your mind? What is justice? Now, I think almost everybody would say it's fairness, isn't it? I think that's what comes to the top of most people's mind. And that will certainly be right in the center, literally, of this concept, as you'll see. But there are other facets to it. And we've gotten far enough in the narrative that we can stop now and have what I shall call very carefully a first statement, which obviously means there's going to be a second and a third and a fourth, all right? So this is a first shot at it. I'm going to do something today that, generally speaking, I won't do. I'm going to step outside the story. We've been trying to read the Bible within the story and ask, what did Adam know? What did Eve know? What did Sarah know? What was in the head of Abraham? What was Jacob thinking about? So we were trying to work within the heads of the actors and actresses, and also trying to ask, what did the narrator know? What was in the mind of the narrator? What was the narrator trying to communicate? I'm going to step outside today of the story and work abstractly and look at the story as an outsider rather than trying to imagine myself into it. So I'm going to try to develop a concept of justice. Even the word concept needs a bit of work, doesn't it? I have a book, 600 pages thick, written by the professor of concepts at MIT. All right? Isn't that interesting? Professor of concepts at MIT. It's a wonderful book. If you're interested, you can send me an email and I'll send you the reference on that. And he talks about just how we even do concepts. And I realize there's challenges here. For me, a concept is simply structuring materials together in a way that helps me make sense out of them. If it's all just bits and pieces laying on a table, it's hard to understand how they work and how they relate to each other. So I'm going to try to put the pieces of justice that we've already collected within Genesis, which is actually a lot more than you might think we have, and see if we can put them together in a concept. Now, let me say right up front that the concept of justice, as I'm going to state it, is not found in the Bible. Can I say that again? It's not found in the Bible, and at the risk of being misunderstood, in the same way that the concept of the Trinity is not found in the Bible. Now, the bits are there, aren't they? But somebody else put them together. So today, I'm putting together pieces that I find in here and am trying to structure this. The source of the materials for this story or this concept come from the story itself. So I'm limiting myself to Genesis, and once in a while I run out of petrol, and so I say, well, the narrator knows the whole of the Pentateuch, and so I use the Pentateuch, right? And once I go into the Psalms, but I'll apologize for that. But I'm limiting myself to Genesis as my primary text, so I'm still trying to tell the concept of justice from within the story where I am. Does that make sense? Yeah, all right. I mean, it's a very different way than other people do things. Now, I've been greatly tempted, and I've resisted the temptation to bring books and pass them around, all right? If I were teaching at Negest, Nairobi Evangelical Graduate School of Theology, right, which sponsors this, please send in all your money. If I were teaching at Negist, I would come with 20 or 30 books to class every week and send them around to you. But you don't need a master's degree. I'm not going to examine you, thank God. And you probably don't have time to read them anyhow, do you? But I am going to send around one book because it is so seminal in terms of concept structure. And that's by Charles Stephen Mott. He's a Methodist. He was for many years professor of ethics at Gordon Conwell, a Harvard PhD. This is, I think, his first publication. He has one or two others. It's now out of print, but you can find used copies at that wonderful place called Amazon. So go there and click for $5 plus postage, you can get it. And I will send this around. Chapter 4 is on justice. It's worth the price of the book. Now, he's not the most lucid writer in the whole world, but it was a wonderful tool to me back in 1984 when it came out. I will send it around. Let me show you how graduate students read books, all right? You need to learn this. Got it. All right. If you're an undergrad, you can still open it and turn the pages, but if you're a graduate student, you need to learn how to do that. All right. So I want to look at the materials and put them together. Now, let me talk as a missionary. As a missionary, and I'm going to say a little bit today while I'm doing abstractions about how to interpret the Bible. Now, I have a whole chapter on this. It's chapter 1. I didn't give it to you because I thought it was too much up front. At the very end, we'll see how it goes, I will do the introduction at the end, which is not a bad idea, really, and maybe give you chapter 1, but chapter 1 is a detailed discussion about the methodology that we're using in this section, all right? Hermeneutics, if you like big words. But in this section, I want to talk about going from my home country, and I really am a Hoosier. I was born in the Methodist Hospital. I'm a graduate of Broad Ripple High School, all right? I mean, I'm the real thing. And as a missionary, I was sent to the Philippines by this church back in 1975, and I had to move in space to an entirely different culture. And you prayed for me and my wife and our kids, and you supported me, and the first thing we did besides sweat when we got off the plane was that we learned to eat with chopsticks. That was the only thing on the table in Singapore. They forced down our throats a course on articulatory phonetics, which tells you to put your tongue in places it doesn't want to go. And then we read a lot of history about Chinese religions and Asian religions. And then we moved to the Philippines, and we're out in the boondocks, and for a whole year very intensely tried to get hold of that world's most complicated language, as I found out about 4 years ago, Tagalog, because it has what linguists call focus. It's the only language in the world that has focus. If you change the focus in the sentence, every single word, the infix, the prefix, and the suffix changes. And I want to tell you, that's fun. Well, fun now, but it wasn't fun then. So I learned the language. You know, that's what missionaries do, isn't it? But as soon as I got enough language where I could say, you know, hello, how are you, you know, and so on, they began to send me to a church where it was all in Tagalog, which I didn't understand. But I could look around and I could see the dog coming into the church. I could see people leaving late, people leaving, coming in late. I could see all kinds of things going on in the church, people selling things in through the window. And I began to pick up what we call culture, right? And so I was fascinated by that. Our language teacher took us off once on a Saturday outing, and she, in front of hundreds of people, recited Tagalog poetry, which of course went straight over the top of my head because it was just far complicated. But I was exposed to a genre of literature in the Tagalog language that I knew nothing about. And then we began to go to funerals, and we went to weddings, and we went to baptisms, and we watched our neighbor across the street kill a pig, stuff it, and roast it, you know, on a spit right in front of our house, and then cut it up and serve us pieces. Of course, the best piece is the skin. You know that, don't you? And if you're the honored guest, you get to eat the head. So yeah, oh boy. You don't want to be too many honored guests when you're there. And slowly we began to learn our way into this world, and we read sociology, and we read anthropology, and we read economics, and yes, we read politics, and slowly we began to get a hang of how the Philippines worked. The real question, of course, was, how do these people relate to each other? And one of the things they did was they gave gifts to each other. And my wife and I made a decision very early on that we would give and receive gifts. Most missionaries didn't do that, but we were young and foolish. And so we gave and received gifts and entered into lowland reciprocity, in which the chief value in that culture is to have smooth interpersonal relationships, pakiki-sama, with other people. That's far more valuable than making a profit. You see the difference, don't you? Well, I mean, we spent many days and hours trying to understand the Filipino culture. I want to suggest for you, because you understand that, right? Huh? You understand what I'm saying to you, don't you? And you approve of it, don't you? You say, that's a good thing. Yep, you did the right thing as a missionary. God bless you. Now, I want to suggest that the same thing's true for travel in time, and that when we go to the Bible, and we travel not in space, but we travel in time, that the same principles are true. Now, you know that people who go off to seminary learn Greek and Hebrew, don't you? But that's not the end of it. In fact, it's just the beginning, and I say this carefully. I did 7 years of Greek like everybody else in my profession did, and I taught Greek for many years. God rest the poor souls of the students on whom I inflicted Greek grammar. I mean, you need to learn some Greek, you need to learn some Hebrew, and probably need to learn some Aramaic, and who knows what else. But that's just a basic level, right? Missionaries can be bilingual, but not bicultural. Do you understand the difference? I had missionary friends who spoke Tagalog impeccably, but didn't have a clue what was going on in the culture. Just because you can read Hebrew backwards, and of course that's the way it's read, isn't it? Just because you can read Hebrew or Greek doesn't mean you really understand too much about the culture of the Bible. And so what we really need to do is to imagine, and I do use that word carefully, imagine our way back into the cultural world of the Bible, and the same sort of steps that one would use to travel in space are the same sort of steps that one would use to travel in time. And I will use some of those today. Now, all that to say this, that the world of the Bible, and interestingly enough, the world of the Philippines, are both traditional worlds. And our world is a modern world. Huh? And you're a very modern person, aren't you? I just bought and installed on my Windows 7 Professional Personal Brain 5.512, right? Every day they send me a new edition, and it's guaranteed to completely organize and transform your life or your empty brain back, right? It is the most sophisticated, cutting-edge software in the world on personal organization, right? If you don't have it, well, then that explains why you're disorganized. And so I'm a very modern person. I'm a very modern person. And I enjoy being a modern person. But I know that the Bible is not a modern book. And I'm going to quickly just mention two things that we've already talked about, and then come to a third one that's very important for justice. First of all, the modern world is dualistic, all right? Whereas, and we've talked about this before, this world is monistic, by which I mean, and I'm sort of Humpty Dumpty here, defining my own term, a monistic world is a world in which the physical and the spiritual can be distinguished. You know the difference between praying and eating a ham sandwich, but not separated. A modern world is a world in which the physical and the spiritual are both distinguishable and separable. So that when the airplane begins to go down, I don't say my prayer. Now actually, a lot of people revert back to traditional form at that point. But you know, if you're going to see the doctor and she says, aha, sore throat, write something on a paper, sends you off to the pharmacist, you get there, the pharmacist, who's 95% handwriting analysis, 5% chemist, picks it up, looks at it and says, aha, Mr. Wood, you have a sore throat. The doctor says, cast out one evil spirit. Oh, no, you thought you were going to get Cipro. No, cast out. No, you say, you go see a different doctor. But you see the difference, don't you? Whereas in Africa, if you got a sore throat, one of the first things that comes to your mind is, am I encountering an evil spirit? That's not our world, is it? The traditional world is also a societal world. That is, societal things are more important than personal things, where this is an an individualistic world, whereas I do my self-planning. In a traditional world, a child never sits down with a personality index test and half a dozen books on where to go to university and says, I will now plan my own goal. No, 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 no. In a traditional world, the whole clan comes together and thinks about this thing, and when you get married, you may have some choice in it, but you don't have to negotiate that with your parents and with their parents and with your uncles and with your aunts. You know that, don't you? I've been to these. I've watched the negotiation. It's not a personal choice. I don't fall in love with Lucy and go off and get married to her. It just doesn't happen unless the couple has broken out of their traditional mold. Now I want to come to a third characteristic which makes a huge difference in justice, at least I think it does. In the modern world, when I go to Washington, D.C. every summer to visit my family, there's that White House. You know about that, right? And there are people living in that. They keep changing. I guess the rent's too high. But anyhow, there's a White House, right? Way down at the other end of the street is a Congress, right? And then someplace else, and I'm afraid I can't remember exactly where it is the Supreme Court. Those are three distinct and separable institutions, aren't they? Now, in fact, they're so separable that sometimes they fight with each other, don't they? About who really is going to do what. In the traditional world, you can distinguish between making laws, the legislative, between executing the laws, the executive, and between adjudicating about the law, the judicial, right? You can distinguish those functions, but oftentimes in one person or in one group of persons, all of those functions come together so that the chief in a typical African village will do all of those plus offer sacrifices to the gods. Plus offer sacrifices to the god. You feel the difference? So today we're going to talk about forensic justice. That's this part up here, which I will also call judicial. And then we will talk about two other aspects, and I'm going to suggest that retributive justice and distributive justice, that these are related, and while we in the Western world tend to try to make very sharp distinctions between them, that in the biblical text, which is the traditional world, those lines are blurred. Can I say that again? Those lines are blurred. And that may not pay off now, but hold on to that. And someday when you're reading Isaiah and you're trying to figure out what all the righteousness and justice vocabulary in Isaiah is doing, something like this will be exceedingly helpful in trying to tease out those various aspects. Now, the concept of justice as a concept does not make sense by itself. That is, concepts don't exist in isolation either in the traditional world or the modern world. So although we have this concept of justice, we have God, who is more than a concept but not less. We have promise, given in the form of covenant, which is a concept. We have God blessing, which is a concept. We have God cursing, which is the flip side of that concept. We have God showing, probably as a part of this, mercy, which is clearly a concept. Now, these are not justice vocabulary terms. These are not justice vocabulary terms. But they are so close to the justice concept that to remove them from the justice concept, you wouldn't understand how the concept functioned within Israel. All right? So maybe at the end of this 12 weeks, and if not, certainly at the beginning of the next one, I will take the concept of justice and put it in a larger setting called, and this is a bit artificial, the bringer of justice model. All right? So I will set thank you for smiling and laughing. The concept then will go with inside of a model. Well, I told you be abstract. What do you expect? Yeah, but this is the way abstractions work, isn't it? Now, I'd like to define my terms. And the terms I would like to define are the word term and the word concept. And I'd like to say right up front, I will use the word term and concept as interchangeable. Right? I'll use the word term and concept interchangeable. I will try to be careful about that. And I'd like to give credit right up front to a man, a Jewish man, Mortimer Adler, who taught the great books at Columbia University for many years. In his book called How to Read a Book, he very carefully works on this word term. Now, before you go out and buy that book, which is a great book to buy for your kids because it will teach them how to read a book, and I used it for many years in university as a text, it has some deficiencies, and that is, it only deals with expository material, it doesn't deal with narrative, I don't know why. It doesn't pay adequate attention to genre within the text, and worst of all, it doesn't realize that people stand outside the text and who they are, moderns, influences the way they work on a traditional text. But having said that, it's still a tremendous book, and in his 8 analytical steps of reading, step 5 is define your terms. Can you define your terms? So I want to do that. I would say a concept or a term, in my way of using it, are the same thing, and I will use them interchangeably. And the term, as defined by Adler, and I'm going to quote him, is a word used unambiguously. It's a word used unambiguously. Now, I'm going to impress you with my learning today. I shared offices with linguists for many years, and they taught me a very interesting word. I'm not sure it's even in the dictionary, so don't try it in Scrabble. It's to disambiguate, all right? Oh, isn't that nice? Disambiguate. So if we disambiguate a word, it's used unambiguously, and then it's a term. How do you do that? Words only become terms in a context. If I say run, and I say to you, what does it mean? Well, you really can't tell, all right? And I very carefully didn't say run. Then you would know, wouldn't you? Because I've contextualized it with my body language, which also counts. Now, I want to tell you very briefly what Adler says about words and terms. It's worth the price of the course, all right? You get very fancy books in semantics and in theology that work on these things, but Adler says it very simply, and I want to stick with him. He will tell you that one term can be and often is represented by many words. One term being concept here, all right? Now hold on to that. So if I ask about the term or the concept, run home, how might that be expressed in other words? Well, trot home, jog home, walk home briskly, go home, return home. We have many ways of expressing that, don't we? We can use multiple words to express the one concept. Now, this is not a university class, and most of you have already passed this, so this is going to be wasted on most of you, but there's one or two here that it might work on. How do you tell a young lady that you love her? Well, I mean, it's not wasted on us old people either, is it? I mean, I bought flowers yesterday. Did you buy flowers? Yeah. And I've only been married 45 years. How do I tell this lady I love her? Do you have to use the word love? Do you always have to say, I love you? Oh, no, you can say, I adore you. I cannot live without you. I worship the ground your feet touch. And then you can shift to Browning and these other people and just, you know, go right off into the air and see if it works. Now, I want to make a very careful application of this to justice, all right? How does this work in terms of justice? The concept justice is going to be represented by many words, isn't it? And so I can't just look up the word justice in Strong's Concordance and say, got it. No, I don't got it. And a huge amount of theology makes that fundamental mistake. Now, James Barr, back in 1962, tried to warn the world in his book on semantics that that wouldn't work. But many theologians persist in going to the concordance, looking up the word love, and they think they got it. That's really entirely wrong-headed. It just doesn't work at all. So we have to pay attention to a range of words. Now, I want to make an admission here, and I don't know what else you could say about this. Who's to decide which words make up the concept? And the answer is me. All right? I mean, it's subjective. Now, it's not entirely subjective, or we couldn't even talk about it, could we? But there certainly is an element of subjectivity as to how I structure the words that I bring together to do this, and I will draw different circles even and talk to you about that. We have already encountered two of the key words for justice. One of them is the SPT, and I'm working in Hebrew now, root, which has the idea usually of just, justice, judgment, judging, all those kinds of things, all right? The other one is the SDQ root, which usually is translated right, righteousness, justify, to put right, to make right, these sort of things. There's one other that doesn't occur in Genesis. We won't get it until Exodus, but it's a very key term, and it's the YSR group, and it usually is translated upright or equity or something like that. And these three terms in that Visio diagram that I sent to you that you can't open are often used together in the same sentence where they are obviously synonyms. And so we can use these as a fairly sure basis. Yashar's root meaning is straight. Now, in addition to words, there are also, and almost always this gets missed out, but it's so desperately important, and would just explode your idea about justice once you get onto it, are metaphors. I mean, if you like C.S. Lewis, probably part of the reason why you like him is he speaks with metaphors, doesn't he? And metaphors work well. The Lord is my shepherd. I mean, we all work with metaphors. They're just beautiful and they move us. The metaphors for justice, now they're not stated in Genesis, so I'm cheating a bit, all right? I'm getting ahead of the story. The fundamental metaphors for justice are straight, yashar means straight, as opposed to its antonym, crooked. Light, yes, light, as opposed to its antonym, darkness, all right? And then the other one, which is very clear in Isaiah 5, but you might miss it, is fruit, opposed to its antonym bad fruit or sour fruit, all right? Those are very basic metaphors. And then in addition to these, there are other minor terms that don't occur quite so often and are not quite in the center, and we've had some of these, the word din and the word blameless tamim, we've had those. They're not quite so frequent, but they're there. And then the other one, and here, you know, you're right on the cutting edge of where I'm trying to think. The other way that the Bible talks about justice is in actions. It's in actions. It dramatizes justice for us. And that almost always gets left out of any sort of abstract systematic mix. I'm going to try to hang on to that. And so you can see that if you're going to look up all these words and all the minor words and all their metaphors and then try to think about the actions, that this will take you about 50 years, all right? Maybe 60 if you're a little slow like me. I'm not going to get this done, and I'm hoping that there'll be other people who come along and get this done. There are bits and pieces of it all over the literature in English, a lot of it in German, some of it in French, laying in the libraries, but it's never been stitched together as far as I know. You with me? So what we're doing here really is, I use this word very carefully, not just distinctive, but unique. Now hopefully somebody will come along before me and do it, and I can just retire and go fishing with my grandchildren, which would be a lot easier. But this needs to happen because I'm going to suggest for you, I've already suggested, that justice is at the center of what God's doing. And I'm not saying it is the center, I'm saying it's at the center, right? And if we don't understand and practice justice, that we've probably missed what's really on God's heart and at the center. Now, let me run the thing the other way around just for the sake of clarity, and that is that one word can be expressed in many terms. all right? So you can have one word can express many terms. And let me just do this for you quickly. The word run. What does the word run mean? And here I'm going to disambiguate it, all right? I'm going to use the word run as multiple terms by putting it in multiple contexts. Run home, home run on a bank, his nose is running, she has a run in her hose. Not the same run, is it? It's the same word, but the word used in different contexts becomes different terms. Huh? Did you understand that? Good, you all get master's degrees. Yeah, that's what you learn at graduate school, isn't it? You learn how to manipulate words and how these words work. So we want to watch that, which means that when I look up a word in the dictionary, such as mishpat, which is one of the standard words spun off of SPT, which means justice usually. When I look up mishpat in Genesis, if I run my eye down the concordance to chapter 40, verse 13, I find this entry. Let me read it to you. After the former manner when thou wast his butler. Where's mishpat? Did you get it? Let me read it again. See if you can find it. After the former manner when thou wast his butler. Let me take it out of King Jimmy and put it in NIV. Just as you used to do when you were his cupbearer. How's mishpat being rendered? The word mishpat is being rendered manner or used to do. Isn't that interesting? Has nothing to do with justice. So it's like run. I mean, put it in a different context, you disambiguate it, it becomes a different word. So when you look up a concordance, you say, justice is used 265 times. You don't know that until you've read all of them. You don't know that until you've read all of them. All right, now I want to move on quickly to the facets of justice, the star of justice. There are 6 facets. 5 points of the star, and then the center. I've already started on this. Forensic, judicial, retributive, distributive. Over here I'll have standard and conduct. Those are my 5 points of the star. And in the center, modifying all of them, is fairness or justly. That all of these have to be done fairly. Justice done unjustly is not justice, is it? We all know that, don't we? Justice done unjustly is not justice. And this will become extremely important as we move along through the storyline. So we've got these, and this is the first statement. I'm trying to illustrate each one of these now from the Genesis story as best I can. Forensic and judicial, all right? Forensic or judicial, and let me define my term here, has to do with a court situation. We talk about forensic medicine or forensic evidence, right? Forensic's not a word I use every morning when I get up, all right? Judicial is a bit more within my range, but they mean the same sort of thing. And words such as court and case and judge and condemn and acquit and guilty and innocent are all associated with this facet. And so you could see how you could multiply the vocabulary just around this facet, all right? These are not all necessarily justice terms, although some of them are, but they certainly are associated with the concept. The key here is the judge, the shapat, the one doing justice. And of course, we've already seen in Genesis that the judge is God. Will not the judge of all the earth do justice, right? 18:25. Or Sarah appeals and says, God, judge between me and you. And that also happens between Jacob and Laban. May God judge between us. So it's a forensic situation. May they decide on the basis of the evidence. Even Lot is called a judge in Genesis 19:37. Has this man come to judge us? So the forensic sense is there. Now let me cheat a little bit and broaden the lens a little bit and move in the Pentateuch to Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 1. Just listen to this word. I mean, if this was a chocolate-covered peanut cluster, it'd be all peanuts, all justice terms, with a little bit of chocolate holding them together, right? Maybe that's not a good illustration, but you get the idea. Just let's listen to this. If you got the notes, I've put all the Hebrew justice terms in so you can see them. If there is a controversy, rib, it's the standard Hebrew term for a controversy in a law court. If there's a controversy between men, and they come unto judgment, mishpat, that the judge, shapat, may judge, shapat, them, what's he to do then? If you got these guys coming into controversy before the judge, what does the judge do? Now listen to this. It'll be a little bit of a spin that maybe you don't know if you've been reading too much Paul and not enough Deuteronomy. They shall, and I'm quoting King Jimmy here because it's very interesting, they shall justify the righteous. That's what the judge does. The judge justifies, says King James, the righteous, and will condemn the wicked. What does it mean to justify the righteous? It means to say what is true about them. They are not guilty of this crime. They are innocent, and so you justify the righteous. Now, almost all modern translations steer away from that. Let me read you the NIV. When men have a dispute, they are to take it to the court, and judges will decide, acquitting, you see the difference? Acquitting the innocent, I mean, that's what you ought to do in court, isn't it? And condemning the guilty. Or the NRSV, suppose two persons have a dispute and enter into litigation. Ooh, there you really get it, don't you? Litigation, not even sure I can spell that. And the judges decide between them, declaring the one to be in the right and the other to be in the wrong. Now, let me just step back a second and say to you, which one of those translations, and I've only given you 3, all right? I could have given you 30, you know that. Which one of those translations is, I hate to use the word right, but correct, huh? Which one of those translations is correct? And let me say again what is becoming painfully obvious to me as I try to express what I'm discovering in the Bible about this is much of the real problem of discussing justice lies not in the Hebrew and the Greek. I mean, there are some problems there. Much of the real problem of justice lies in our heads and the way we use the English language. Right? And if you could speak German or French or Tagalog or Swahili or Spanish, it would be fascinating to carry on a conversation and say to you, how does this sound in Spanish? If you can read those languages, go look them up. How does this sound in Swahili? I mean, this is part of the fun of teaching at Next, where last year we had 71 distinct languages spoken, right? And so I would teach Greek class with 12 students. We'd have at least 15, 20 languages represented, and we'd do English, we'd do Greek, and then we'd do Swahili, and we'd do Kikuyu, and we would do Kamba. I'd ask, what does that mean in English? Oh, what an interesting. And how did the translators get to that? I mean, someday the missionaries will translate the Bible from Hebrew into Greek, I say this quietly, into English, and get it right, okay? Do you understand what's going on underneath the surface about the semantics and the linguistics and the cross-culturalness? Yeah, it's really difficult work. All right, I'm going to leave forensic with you. There's a lot more to learn, but that we learn in Genesis. Standard, which I would define as norm or often expressed in law, but not necessarily confined to law. And standard and conduct are pairs. They go together, they're not the same. And retribution and distribution are pairs. They go together, but they're not the same. Huh? So the next two facets, standard and conduct, are a pair. Standard has to do with what people ought to do. With what people ought to do. The standard can be expressed and will be expressed later in a revealed law, the law of Moses. But there are many indications in the text of Genesis that the actors understood what ought and ought not to be. Abimelech clearly understood that when Abraham had given him Sarah to be his wife, that he ought not to have done that, right? I mean, Abimelech's very clear about that. And they understand oughts. There's a book by Bruckner who deals with all the oughts and ought nots in Genesis. It's very interesting reading. And you could do it. Adam and Eve had a sense of ought and ought not, didn't they? So you don't need to have some codified law chiseled out on stone to have a standard. No, you can have standards long before that, expressed orally and carried in the culture as oughts and ought nots. We get this very curious verse in Genesis 26:5, which we haven't looked at before. Let me read it to you. Because Abraham obeyed me, and we know he did that, he was quite good at that finally, and kept my requirements, my commandments, my decrees, and my laws. Here you have all the vocabulary for standard all clustered together. And I've given you in the notes the Hebrew expressions. The last word for law is Torah. You've heard that in Hebrew, haven't you? And so Abraham knew all these things, and you wish that your Bible had a footnote you could click on and say, so what did he know? Well, he knew a lot more than we give him credit for, I suspect. A lot more than we give him credit for. And we'll talk about that next year when we get to the law and ask, how different is the law from what people already knew? And the answer is, not all that much. Now, as we move through the story, we shall observe that different actors are held to different standards. Now, this is, I'm skating out on thin ice, and I can hear it cracking. Now, I don't mean to say that the standard is relative in a really genuinely relative sense. But I do mean to say, because I think Scripture says this, that the standard of justice is relational. And that there are different standards for different relations. Now let me say something that I hope is clear and will convince you. The standard for Israel is a different standard than the standard for the non-Israelite. And you can see that by reading the first 3 chapters of Amos, where it talks about sins. And the sins of the surrounding nations are all war crimes. The sins of Judah and Israel are far more focused and far more specific and come right out of the Ten Commandments. So I would say that the standard is relational. Some people say justice is only relational. Some people act as if justice is only standard. I would have thought that it's both, that justice works in a situation where there's a standard that pertains to that relation. Now, I think in everyday life we understand that. Certain standards in a school, certain standards in a church, certain standards between child and parent, certain standard between teacher and student, certain standard between teacher and teacher and administrator. I use myself as this illustration. And we understand those standards, and we don't think that they really are a problem. Now, conduct or character. Now, I have a dialogue partner on this, who watches on video every week, and he said to me, I would think that conduct is better expressed as character. And so I'm off thinking about this, and so, you watch me thinking on my feet, which is not the best way to think, is it? I've struggled with labeling this facet. I usually have used conduct as the label, and by that I mean behavior, action of the person. Such conduct or actions are judged to be right when they stand in conformity to the standard. So these are pairs. I measured the conduct by the standard, and it has to do with a relationship, and persons are judged to have right behavior or actions are righteous. If a person conforms to this standard, then we say about that person, as is said about Noah, he's righteous. But the problem with Noah is we don't quite know what standard he was keeping, right? We just know that he was righteous. And you say, so how is he righteous? What made him righteous? By what standard is he being measured? Now, the word character perhaps should also be used. Now, to my ear, now again, this is an English problem, I think. To my ear, conduct has to do with actions and behavior. Character is more virtue and static, whereas conduct is dynamic. Obviously, the two are related. Your conduct flows out of your character, right? But it seems to me, and I'm struggling with this, that the downbeat, the accent, the cadence in the biblical text lies on actions. And so when righteousness is defined in Ezekiel 18 and Matthew 25, to go way out of the context, it has to do, the righteous person is one who clothes the naked, feeds the hungry, protects the orphan, does justice for the widow. You with me? That these are all observable actions. And so they're not really in competition with each other. Now, I've worked a little bit on this because it has become fashionable now in theological circles, and it will percolate down to the church circles, maybe it already has, to talk about character formation. Character formation. Well, we've formed a number of characters ourselves, but we'll leave that off to one side. But character formation. And how do you do that? Well, you send them to chapel every day. Sure. Character formation. How do you form character? I want to suggest for you, by the time we get to the end of this study, we'll know something about righteousness as the central marker for what God wants of us. And I'm going to say this to keep you awake. It's not holiness, at least not in the Old Testament. What God wants of us is righteousness. And that's the character marker that he's looking for and finds in Noah, requires of Abraham, and we'll follow the story on through. Now I'm going to skip a little bit because we're beginning to run out of time. We could talk about Tamar, where it said that she is more righteous than I because she conformed to the standard of Levitical expectations. This is Genesis 38:26. And perhaps the clearest example of conduct is Genesis 18:19, to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice, which has to do with right behavior. And I think that certainly is part of that verse. It may not be the whole of the verse. And so Abraham was in the business of character formation. He was in the business of helping the conduct of his children and his grandchildren. So conduct's very important. I'm going to leave that and go to the other side now. Retributive justice, which is often used in terms of punishment, and I think that's probably not unfair. Again, it's a pair with distributive justice. This is sort of the negative, this is the positive, obviously. I'm simply using standard terms. I don't really like them, but I don't want to invent another set of awkward terms. I will simply deal with the awkward terms I've inherited. In retributive justice, the sentence is given by the judge after investigating the data. So the judge goes down to Sodom, right, to ask about the outcry, remember this from last week, to find out if it's true. And when they get there, they find, yes, these people are very inhospitable, right? And so the outcry really is true. They're oppressive people. And so he's got the truth of the situation as a judge. And then it says in Genesis that the Lord rained down burning sulfur on Sodom, 19:23. And that is retributive justice. Now, I've said before, and I'm not going to do it again here, many of us, including many Christians, have a very difficult time with retribution. Isn't God loving and merciful, and how in the world do you put that together with retribution? Well, we'll work on that. But it doesn't do us any good if we're trying to be biblical to simply sweep this off the side or say this is lower class material and eventually will evolve into the New Testament. Well, you just got to be careful not to evolve into the book of Revelation, right? Because you're right back there again, huh? So that doesn't work. The old evolutionary hypothesis of the liberals that God was getting smarter and better every year, no, that one's dead. I mean, once in a while you get an old unreconstructed Wellhausian who teaches that in graduate school, but it's long since dead. It just doesn't work. So we've got to come to grips with this. Jesus is going to talk about hell, isn't he? So what are we going to do about that? And I'm not going to do it this year, but next year I will take a whole session, maybe two, and tackle head-on the huge problem of harem. Harem is the word translated, you will utterly and absolutely destroy all the men, all the women, all the children, and then it adds to it, show them no mercy. Deuteronomy chapter 7. You know that verse, don't you? What do we do about that? And we'll take that on. I think we can only answer some of these odd passages, I mean odd in the sense that they are odd to us, by putting them within a model where they make some sense, all right? And you can begin to generate some reasonable sense of why God does these things and how these things work. Now, a striking aspect of retributive justice is that it is obvious in the expulsion of Adam and Eve from the garden, in the flood, and in the confusion of the tongues of Babel, those are all obvious justice, retributive acts, aren't they? But what's very interesting is the vocabulary for justice is not used. The vocabulary for justice is not used. So when I'm making up this concept, I need to pay attention not only to words and their cognates and their antonyms and to the metaphors, but I must also pay attention to actions. So it's a huge task, isn't it? I can't just sweep the actions off to the side. And here we have very clear example in Genesis 3 through 11 of retributive justice, but without the vocabulary. Now, if you look for other places in Genesis where the vocabulary for punishment is used, there are a few of them. You know, Cain will say, I cannot bear my punishment. God will say about the people who enslave Israel, after the fourth generation they will be punished. And Abraham says to God, are you going to punish the righteous with the wicked? So the word does occur, all right? The vocabulary for retributive justice is there. We've seen that. Now, let me move on quickly. Our time is going fast, I'm sorry. Distributive justice or restorative justice. Now, you know, I know enough about the literature to know there's some pitfalls here. The restorative justice has a very special meaning in jurisprudence and in modern ideas about prison reform. That's not where I'm going, okay? I mean, I understand something about that, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm simply trying to get another word that is better than distributive, because distributive doesn't really do much for most of us. Of all the aspects of justice, I think this one perhaps the most difficult for us to get hold of because of our upbringing in Western jurisprudence. We understand that the judge, on the basis of true evidence, punishes the guilty person. But oftentimes it's ended there. What about the victim? Well, now in some cases there might be some suit to recover some funds for the victim, sure. But it doesn't really correspond to what you find in the scriptures of Israel, where the downbeat, the accent, the cadence on justice is often on restorative or distributive justice, where the judge himself comes off the bench and finds the oppressed and lifts the oppressed up and restores them to community. That really is biblical justice. Psalm 72, which is way downstream, is replete with that. The king would do justice and righteousness for the needy and the poor. Within Genesis itself, I think it's possible that the Genesis 18:19, to do justice and righteousness, not only refers to standard and conduct, but may also refer to retribution and distribution. Now, let me say that again. I hope you don't think I'm cheating. All right? The little passage there where God says to Abraham, you will teach them the way of the Lord, you teach them to do righteousness and justice, all right? What does that mean? I suggested earlier that it probably refers to standard, but it also could refer to teaching his children to do proper retribution and especially distribution. The passage is really opaque. It's not quite clear. And that brings me to a footnote here to say it's fascinating when you read through the text and you read them in multiple English translations, all right? Just to get your confusion level up there, all right? I mean, you can't learn until you get confused, right? That's why this is such a good class and such an excellent lecture, because I can see by looking at you that you're absolutely confused. I've accomplished my pedagogical goal, all right? You'll be confused on a higher level, and I've done it. I'm a good teacher. All right. But it looks to me like sometimes that both sides of the equation are there. Seek ye first the kingdom of God, even his justice. What's he talking about? Well, we'll come to that in a few years. And you will keep that in mind, and I will ask which one or which ones of the facets are to the fore. Generally speaking, only one facet is to the fore. Are you with me on that? But I think that there are occasions where it's the general concept taken as a whole that is there. I rather imagine that's what we have in Genesis 18:19, although I don't know of any way of proving it. If I really want to find a passage that has to do with distributive justice, I have to look at an action, and that is Abraham going and rescuing Lot. He restores Lot, right? Doesn't he? And the king's with him. That's a distributive action. Or when Abraham prays for the wombs of Abimelech's nation and they're restored to fertility, I would see that as restorative justice. You say healing? Well, listen to this much later text. The Son of Righteousness will rise with, say it, healing. You know that. You see the two related? That healing, restoration, is a righteousness activity. We'll see that very clearly in Jesus, and he's healing some other time. And if we fast forward to Psalm 103, the Lord works righteousness and justice for all of the oppressed. He made known his ways to Moses, his deeds to the people of Israel. Obviously, the Exodus experience, which is being labeled an act of restorative justice, as well as distributive, which we'll see next week. Now, quickly, the last one, the sixth one, is fairness. That all of these things have to be done fairly. And I won't take time to go through that. We did that last week. Will not the judge of all the earth do right, do justice, do justly, do fairly, do fairness? I'm quoting different modern translations, all right? But you can see that the question is the judge going to behave fairly? The opposite of that is the judge takes a what? Takes a bribe, right? And we'll have a lot of Mosaic literature speaking about not taking a bribe because it perverts justice. Now I want to ask very quickly, how do these all go together? Let me just say in a sentence how I think they go together. The judge looks at the evidence, the conduct of people who come before his bench, and sees how that conduct compares or contrasts with the standard of justice, and on the basis of a truthful assessment of that, then either proclaims the person guilty and he receives retribution, or proclaims him innocent and then he receives distribution. Taking me 40 years to come to this, I'll give you a pause, I'll repeat it once, okay? The judge, on the basis of the evidence about the conduct of the person, I will go down and see how Sodom's behaving, compared to some standard. Sodom was breaking some standard, the standard of hospitality primarily, but there's other things going on there too, as you know. And Sodom is guilty, and so he pronounces them guilty, as it were. The text doesn't say that, but it's clearly implied, and executes, the judge himself executes. He becomes the executioner, doesn't he? He's not just the judge. He doesn't say, all right, you guys take him out, and no. He takes off his robes and goes and does it himself, doesn't he? He executes the people at Sodom. If they had been declared innocent, he would have lifted up the orphan, the widow, the alien, the misaccused person. Now, let me just say one closing word, and then we'll call it quits. Although the word shapat, to judge, is often used in this very tight judicial sense that I've just set up, the same word is oftentimes used to mean to rule or to govern. All right? And it's usually the king who rules or governs, and God is king. And so that's used in a non-forensic sense. And so the justice language, although it's clearly oftentimes forensic and law court in that sense, it does have a broader sense. And as we move through the text, we'll encounter those places where God is ruling and God is governing, and that's apparently part of the wider understanding of justice.